Midnight blue pooled in the security room like an ink stain. Screens hummed one after another, each a window onto rooms Bramwell Rossy had chosen to keep in glass. The nursery with its white mobile now turned to museum, the terrace where a single lemon tree shivered, the long hallway lined with portraits of decisions. He sat at the center of that constellation with the ledger open on his lap, the leather-bound book where he catalogued exposures the way others kept lists of appointments. Names, dates, small notations of risk, margins where his hand scrawled remedies. He treated the ledger like architecture: measure twice, cut once. Bramwell believed in seeing. If his eyes reached into corners, he reasoned, nothing could reach back and surprise him. Cameras were extensions of that certainty, glass on hinges, hungry lenses that turned domestic life into data he could fold and file. For years they had kept him safe in a way that money could buy. They kept the city at arm's length, kept the ledger neat. On a monitor at the center of the room, Addie lay beneath a swell of linen and shadow. A moon lamp hummed above her bed, its crescent light catching in the tiny curve of her cheek. Addie's world, once a map of triumphs and piano lessons, had shrunk into rooms and routines. The monitors were Bramwell's way to be present when he could not be in the physical labor of presence. He watched her, not because he distrusted the aides, he paid well for loyalty, but because watching felt like doing. The new aide's first week had been an experiment. Bramwell had picked Cassidy McKenna from a list that read like a resume of good intentions. Training in physical therapy, steady references, the kind of photo where you could see a jaw set against practical kindness. He had expected competence. What unsettled him, in the beginning, was the way Cassidy's hands moved like a second language. She spoke to the monitors as if they were curious relatives, and when she touched Addie, she did not consult the ledger. She watched Addie through her own attenuated lens. The rhythm of a breath, a minute flex of a toe, the angle of a head. Cassidy carried a satchel that sat heavy against her hip, the canvas faded at the edges. She never let it rest in the open. When Bramwell first saw the satchel in the doorway as she set papers on the care table, an outline of a bag like a shadow, he felt the ledger twitch. It was a small thing that made him tighten his hand around the pen. Men like him catalogued other people's secrets not out of curiosity, but out of calculation. The satchel was an unknown variable. On the second week, late shift, Bramwell asked one of his guards to fetch the satchel while Cassidy was in the garden, coaxing Addie to look at a moth trapped in a jar. The guard came back with a handful of photographs and a small journal. The photographs were older, edges softened by time, the face of a man with a half-smile and a head tilt that belonged to grief. On the back of one, a date in Marcus Webb's handwriting, an Eastern District year, a neighborhood Bramwell's ledger had marked years ago with the thick underline of trouble. He read the journal in the quiet of the security room. Cassidy's handwriting was a catalog of small promises made to another life. Appointments kept, dishes warmed, a description of a day when Marcus could lift a spoon again. She wrote in practical increments: sit for 5 minutes, hold cup with left hand, and underlined the tiny triumphs like a midwife noting breaths. Bramwell, who had all his life measured people by transactions and power, felt old-fashioned contempt for the sentiment. He also felt something colder. The sense that the satchel might be leverage, a secret in the right hands could destabilize arrangements he had spent decades arranging. In his mind, the ledger filled with hypothetical columns: exposure, blackmail, liability. It was an accountant's imagination. If Cassidy was connected to Marcus Webb, and Marcus had any claim that implicated components of Bramwell's operations, even innocently, then the ledger's neat lines might blur. He did not think of Cassidy as a spy. He thought of her as a risk calculator in human form, an unscripted variable in a house where every variable was costly. He made the decision like a man who believed in surgical fixes. He would remove the variable before it could come to color. He did not shout. Bramwell never shouted. He dialed the captain of the household security team. In the hush of the call, he said, "Burn the bags." The order arrived not as a command sent straight to Cassidy. There would be deniability for later, but as a gentle instruction routed through intermediaries. A note slid into a pocket, a word at the end of a hallway. "Make sure the photographs are gone," Bramwell told the captain. "No copies left. She doesn't need to carry ghosts in here." The captain, a man whose loyalty had been traded in increments and kept in a drawer, did not like to see compassion in Bramwell's mouth. He reported back with the name of a cleaning service that could handle sensitive disposal. It was neat, clinical. It was the ledger's language made actionable. Cassidy discovered the order in the way most quiet revelations arrive, by way of a misdelivered envelope left at the staff desk, its edges exposed. The note was literal, handwritten in the neat block script of someone accustomed to obedience. Her heart did not leap with drama. It misfired with a softer, older ache, a familiar pressure behind the eyes she had learned to accept after Marcus's injury. She did not have illusions about power. What surprised her was the ledger's desire to erase memory. She thought first of compliance. That was practical. "Burn the bags," she rehearsed in a voice that belonged to people who'd learned to survive in increments. If the risk to Addie's job and the small breathing room she had carved for Marcus could be kept by surrendering an object of grief, perhaps that was the price. At night, she sat on the edge of the staff room and opened the satchel. The photographs slid out like small doors. Marcus at a market stall, smiling at something off-frame. Marcus holding a kettle. Marcus pressing his forehead to Cassidy's, fog on a window between them. There was a photograph, worn at the corner, where Marcus's hand rests on Cassidy's notebook, thumb tucked against the paper. The thumb was a sign of something, a touch that did not demand, a memory that had not been transactional. Bramwell watched from the monitors as Cassidy took Addie's hand one evening and hummed a lullaby in broken Italian, a phrase she had said only once before. "Buonanotte, Luna." Addie's eyes fluttered. She had long since stopped surprise, but the small arc of that eyelid, the almost imperceptible tightening of her fist, looked to Bramwell like complicity. Why would a stranger sing Luna in a house that already hummed with the soft static of surveillance? He noted it in the ledger. Personal attachment. Risk, moderate. Remedy, remove. The order to burn the bags moved through the house like a draft under a door. Quiet but insistent. It arrived at Cassidy's hands with the indifferent efficiency of large machines. A slip of paper folded beneath the plant on the administration desk. She could have ignored it. She could have folded it into a pocket and waited for a better arrangement. She could have asked Bramwell directly, gone to his glass room, and spelled out the ledger's arithmetic in her blunt, honest voice. Instead, she put the bags on the small metal table beside the stairs one evening and set a match beside them. Cassidy carried the heavy bags to the incinerator at the back of the mansion. Bramwell's order echoed in her mind. "Don't open them, just destroy." But as she lifted the first bag to throw it into the flames, she felt a violent jolt from inside. Her heart raced. It wasn't just paper or clothes. Something was vibrating, a rhythmic thumping. Ignoring the cameras, she unzipped the bag just an inch. Inside, hidden among the daughter's clothes, was a hidden medical device and a timed sedative pump, still humming and moving. The bag was alive because the machine was still running. At that moment, Cassidy realized the dark truth. The daughter wasn't paralyzed by illness. Her father was keeping her drugged and monitored to hide a family secret. This was the moment she knew she had to act. Cassidy's hands were steady enough. She had learned to steady herself around fragile bodies, around the spasm of a limb, around the way a shoulder could remember a fall. She held the photographs and the journal above a metal bin, the way one might hold a candle above a clasped hand. The match flared. The first photo browned at the edge and let go with a soft curl. Smoke rose, and the scent of old paper climbed into the air like a memory burning its own archive. She did not expect the thumb. The room where Addie rested was across the lawn, a rectangle of sleep and medical machines. Cassidy had been careful, as if ritual could make her conscience pure. She had set the satchel for burning after she checked Addie's line, changed her sheets, tucked the blanket up. She had smoothed the stray curls and leaned in and heard, barely, the Italian lullaby she hummed dissolve into the sleep machine's rhythm. Then, at the exact moment the match's flame kissed the photograph's last corner, a pressure closed around Cassidy's finger. It was not a sound so much as a small physical fact. Someone had gripped her thumb. It was Addie. Not a deliberate squeeze in the way a child who uses a hand to demand. Rather, it was the infinitesimal sign of recognition, a reflex like a moth bumping a window. Addie's hand, which had been a pale, still thing at Cassidy's wrist earlier, had curled. Her thumb closed against Cassidy's, as if insisting on the contact they had spent weeks rehearsing. The monitors, those blue-eyed sentries, caught the movement. On the screen, Bramwell saw a tiny fist tighten and then relax. The ledger in his lap might have recorded it as anomaly, physical response. On the other end of the house, Cassidy felt the weight of a life against her. The felt movement, simple, precise, utterly uncalculable, stopped the burn in a way that no ledger could. Cassidy lowered the match, the flame guttering in the damp of her lungs. She brought the satchel back to her chest. For a moment, in the small wet dark between the paper and the hand, decisions rewrote themselves. She did not hide the satchel then. She did not make dramatic confessions. She sat on the garden bench beneath the lemon tree and opened the journal again as if reading by rote. The photographs lay in a clean stack beside her, edges smoothed. Addie's thumb was a small, stubborn fact. Cassidy's grief and obligation and practical calculations contorted into a single, irreducible choice. She could not destroy the archive that had known Marcus and perhaps known what might be asked of Bramwell's family. The house did not care for such nuance. The ledger fought to bring the page back to balance. Bramwell, across his constellation of screens, saw the match's flare and the hand's response. He saw Cassidy's face relax into decision. He saw, with a new kind of clarity, the possibility that the satchel could be something other than a threat, an instrument of leverage perhaps, but also a repository of truth that his ledger could not unscramble with money or orders. He called the captain. "Bring her to the office," he said. "I want her to explain." The request was not an indictment. Bramwell did not crave public spectacle. He wanted to close variables and understand them. He wanted to inventory reasons, and if the ledger demanded it, to apply remedies. If someone had inside knowledge that could expose the softer edges of his business, the collateral damage in the Eastern District, then the ledger demanded containment. If, on the other hand, this was simply a caregiving woman carrying a satchel of grief, then the ledger needed a different entry. Risk contained by presence. Cassidy stood when the guard approached, the satchel cradled like a living thing. Addie's small hand left her thumb as if to say goodbye, and then curled once more onto the blanket. There was an intimate improvisation happening in the garden, lullabies, sunlight, citrus, that the cameras could not turn into arithmetic. Cassidy crossed the lawn and felt, with the same clarity that made her refuse the match, that she had to speak the truth of the satchel rather than allow it to be erased. She moved through the house the way a woman walks through a city she knows only in the margins, purposeful, but not sure of the blocks. The hallway smelled of lemon and floor polish. Portraits of Bramwell's lineage watched like small censors. She climbed the soft stairs that led to the glass room where the man took his ledger's measure. Bramwell had been standing when she entered. He wore the same shirt he always favored in the evening, sleeves rolled, his tie loosened like a band he never fully removed. The monitors painted him in backlight, his face red as architecture, sharp lines softened by the blue glow. He did not stand to greet her. Instead, he gestured to a chair and opened the ledger on the desk between them like a table of contents. "Burn the bags," he said without preface, the words a residue from the captain, unchanged in his mouth. There was no anger to them. Anger would have been simpler, more honest. This was something clinical, a surgical instruction handed off as if sterilized. Cassidy set the satchel on her lap and took its weight into account. "I started to," she said. Her voice did not tremble. She had learned to let muscles tend to steadiness where language failed. "But Addie, she moved. She grabbed my thumb. I couldn't." Bramwell's eyes flicked to the monitor that showed Addie resting, tiny and face up beneath the moon lamp. He had watched the moment several times already. In his ledger it had registered as evidence of an attachment forming where none should be necessary. "You understand why this is sensitive," he said. "You understand why anything you carry that connects you to other neighborhoods." "Connects me to a man who needs help," Cassidy finished. She did not say, "Who needs your money?" or "Who will accuse you?" She said the thing that made Bramwell odd. She named need. Marcus Webb is a man who wants to stand again. He was hurt in a place your ledger recognizes. I keep photographs because someone, somewhere, needs to know there was a life before the injury. He's training to work. He's starting to do the small things you read about in my notes. Bramwell's fingers traced the margin of the ledger. The rooms beyond the glass stayed blue and still. He weighed the word help like a coin. In his world, help often came with strings. In Cassidy's mouth, help had no strings, only the grammar of returns. "We can't have potential leverage in this house," he said. "Not when we have families to protect, not when reputations—" "Don't do that," Cassidy said. "Don't frame it as reputation. Frame it as lives. Addie is one, Marcus is another. A bag of photographs isn't leverage if the person who keeps them isn't trying to extort you. It's memory." Bramwell's expression did not change, but lines in his face deepened. He was used to being told what the house required. He was used to making the calls that shifted risk. He had never once had to bargain with someone who understood risk on the scale of tenderness. "Why bring him here?" Bramwell asked. It was a ledger question. If Marcus's name intersected in any way with Bramwell's holdings, then the crossing had to be examined. Cassidy answered without flinching. Because he needs work. Because the hospital sent him a bill he can't read. Because there are little things you can't fix with ledgers. Transportation, the right kind of therapy. Because someone who can see him once a week helps him keep trying. I came here to help Addie and to help him. Those things can coexist. She did not say what else she had kept in the journal. Notes of the days they had laughed, of the times Marcus had cried and blamed neither of them for what happened. She didn't say that sometimes she lay awake and thought of revenge, the way an illness takes residence in a body, quietly, with its own rhythms. Mailing a page of grief into a ledger would not have the dignity or the consequence she wanted. Her motives were messy, a stitch of grief, a strip of practical charity, a stubborn desire that someone be returned to work. None of those motives singly justified secrecy, but together they made her human. Bramwell closed the ledger and then opened it again like a man returning to an old practice. He chose his next words with the care of someone removing glass from a wound. "All right," he said finally. "You won't burn the bags. But they stay here. They will be catalogued. We'll put them in a secure file. You will leave the originals, and we will make copies. I will know what is in them." He imagined that compromise would settle the ledger back into neat rows. He imagined accountability without situation. The cameras would keep watch, and the satchel would be transformed from a variable into a file number. He did not yet know the way the felt movement. The thumb that closed on Cassidy's hand had the capacity to complicate the ledger's arithmetic. Cassidy felt the offer as containment rather than vindication. Hands that have kept other people's fragile necessities learn to mistrust cataloging as a solution. To her, the satchel was not simply evidence to be archived. It was a living chain that connected a man who could not read his own name to a world that had forgotten how to hold hands. She thought of the photographs as a record of care, not a dossier of leverage. "Copies," she said slowly, "are never the same." She placed a photograph on the ledger's open page and let Bramwell see Marcus's face. Marcus's smile did something to the glass between them. It made the monitors, their cold blue distance, pan to a close-up that conveyed the brittle humanity Bramwell tried to erase with systems. For a long moment Bramwell kept his hand on the edge of the page. He was a man who measured things in margins. How much to pay, how much to expose. Now his fingers rested in the waterline between exposure and protection, and he did something that unsettled both of them. He made an offer that surprised him. "If the files stay here," he said, "we will use them, not to threaten, to repair. I will establish a fund. Marcus Webb will be assessed for vocational training. We will schedule meetings with your providers. We'll review camera coverage in the house, and I'll come to the meetings." Cassidy held her breath as if a small organ in her chest had to decide whether to trust the air she was given. Bramwell's words had the tone of a ledger entry, but the content of an apology in loops. He was offering the thing that cameras could never buy. Presence. It was too soon to say it meant anything. Bramwell's presence could be performative, money could be dressed up as reparation, and be nothing more than a tax write-off on a conscience. But the ledger had also taught Cassidy how to measure small victories. A fund, meetings, and the promise of presence were things she could work with. If Bramwell kept his word for even a dozen days, Marcus might make a tiny gain on the road to steady work. Addie might have someone who learned to be with her, not watch over her. Before she could reply, the captain of security cleared his throat at the door, as if to remind the room that threats could be renewed. The ledger had not yet balanced itself. Bramwell folded the page, and, with a man whose life had long been shaped by keeping things from spinning, closed his mouth on any expansion. "Keep them here for now," he said. "But you'll have to sign that you understand the terms." Cassidy felt the compromise as a kind of lease. She stood and picked up the satchel like a child reclaiming a toy, the strap biting into her palm. When she moved to leave, Bramwell added, almost as an afterthought, "And limit the overnight trips. We need a clearer log of where you go." There was a ledger logic to even that. Cassidy nodded. Limits were part of the cost of work in a house that had watched over itself for generations. She understood. But when she reached Addie's room on the way out, she paused at the doorway and looked down at the small woman asleep beneath the moon lamp. The skin along Addie's knuckles was the color of porcelain, and the line of her jaw was soft. Cassidy thought of the thumb that had stopped the match from burning. She thought about how small gestures can be the true currency of repair. Outside, the night had thinned. The lemon tree dropped a leaf against the path with a sound like a small coin. Cassidy walked into the dark with the satchel pressed to her side. She had not burned the bags. Instead, she had handed them into a house of glass where a ledger attempted to convert them into entries. The felt movement, the thumb, remained inside her like a compass. Inside the office, Bramwell closed the ledger and watched the camera feed as Cassidy disappeared down the path. He tapped his pen against the page and considered the fund he would open. He was a man who, when given the chance to correct collateral harm, preferred checks and meetings to sentiment, but he knew now, in a way the ledger could not quantify, that the quiet moments mattered. The thumb that had closed around Cassidy's hand was a proof that presence could outpace sight. He made a note. Initiate fund, Marcus Webb, vocational. Review camera policy. He added another line, smaller. Attend first meeting. The ledger felt heavier after that entry, as if it had gained a weight that might make it sag under honesty. Downstairs, the house's staffers, who had moved through the property like parts of a machine, exchanged small looks. Some catalogued the incident as a disturbance. Some catalogued it as a crack where someone might slip. None of them could know yet whether Bramwell's agreement would change their lives. For Cassidy, the satchel was now both a risk and a promise, a small pack of paper that could become an instrument of reparation. She walked past the cameras and felt their eyes like a lamp on the back of her neck. She did not like being watched. But she held now the more important thing, a child's thumb in her memory. She placed the satchel in the small filing room as instructed, a sterile closet of numbered folders and gray light. The staffer who received it nodded in a way that belonged to people who worked inside order. The satchel was catalogued. The photographs were scanned to a secure file with a header that read, Case, Webb, Care Notes. Somewhere off the ledger, someone would later calculate the hours, the payments, the meetings. For now, the satchel rested in a drawer like a seed. Cassidy left the house that night and walked the route she always took. Past the market where the woman with the stacked crates left one for her as an offering, past the clinic window where a nurse raised a hand in recognition. She hummed Buonanotte Luna to herself, as if to test whether lullabies could become an armor. The thumb's closure on her own prevented her from letting the match consume the past. She did not know at that hour whether Bramwell would keep his promise to come to a meeting, whether the fund would be more than ledger poetry. She only knew a handful of facts. Addie had moved a thumb. She had felt that movement. And in a house that had been built to watch, a small, uncalculated gesture had interrupted the ledger's clean line. The next morning, the house resumed its rituals. Monitors reset, staff swapped notes in the kitchen, and the lemon tree took on the light of the new day. Yet a subtle shift threaded the routine. Bramwell found himself lingering at the glass room's edge, listening for small sounds he previously dismissed. Cassidy came to work with an added weight of watchfulness, and the knowledge that what she carried could be counted in both danger and mercy. For now, the ledger sat with an extra entry, a promise written in the same hand that measured risk. Bramwell had not yet learned the language of being present without measuring it, but he had decided to attend the first meeting. He had decided, in a small way, to translate watching into showing up. Outside the house, Marcus Webb stood in front of a vocational center he had visited once before, and hesitated. His fingers flexed in a way that had once been ordinary. He had not known whether anyone would come through from the house where Addie slept under glass with a moon lamp. He had not known if the satchel's photographs held anything more than memory. When a small envelope arrived later that day with a meeting time and the name of a fund he could apply to, an itemization of terms written in bureaucratic bluntness, it looked to him like a doorway. Inside the house, somebody had to turn a camera off, reinstall a curtain, resize a schedule. Some small technicians rewired their maps. These were quiet acts. They were necessary. The ledger required it. The real work, the meetings, the therapy, Marcus's slow rehabbing of muscles, Bramwell learning to wait without recording, remained ahead. Cassidy stood at the staff desk mid-morning and watched Addie on the monitor as a small tremor of laughter slid through the child's face while someone played the melody of an Italian lullaby over the speakers. It had become a house lullaby in a strange inversion. Song on tape where hands could be offered. Cassidy smiled the way someone does when they have been given a fraction of good news and want to spend it. She turned to the satchel drawer and touched the leather as if blessing it. The satchel had not been burned. The match had not consumed the archive. A tiny thumb had prevented the erasure. That act, innocent, not knowing, had become, improbably, the hinge on which choices turned. The ledger would later attempt to absorb the event with entries and numbers. But for the people whose lives had been in the periphery of Bramwell's world, The felt movement was already a narrative, a choice not to erase, a decision to hold. Cassidy looked up when the captain entered the kitchen. He was a man with a practiced blankness who carried messages the way others carried mail. "The boss wants to see you," he said. The words were simple and open-ended. Cassidy read them the way people read invitations to examinations. She smoothed her hands and considered the satchel in the drawer. She had made a small bargain with fragility. Now she walked back into the house where glass watched the world like a jury. She went upstairs, palms steady. The ledger had given an answer that involved files and funds and meetings. The felt movement had not solved anything permanent, but it had, in that single moment, redirected the arithmetic of the house. The door to Bramwell's office closed behind her with a sound that marked the transition from one type of watching to a confrontation that would demand language rather than camera angles. She could feel the weight of the satchel like a promise and like a charge. On the monitor, Addie turned toward the sound of footsteps, as if to say goodbye to the thumb that had pressed against Cassidy's finger. The house, lit by screens and lemon light, waited for what would come next, whether the ledger would learn to make space for touch, or whether it would fold the entire episode into columns and figures that missed the truth of a small human movement. Outside, the city did what it always did. It kept moving. Inside, for the first time in a long while, a man who built walls and a woman who mended small things had agreed in the hush of a glass room to see what they could build together. Awkwardly, imperfectly, and with the inevitable ledger entries to prove it. The felt movement had interrupted their plans. Now both of them had to act on the interruption. There was a thin precision to the way Bramwell kept promises once he had written them into the ledger. Promises could be inked, dated, and checked off. They could be parceled into budgets and staff assignments. That was the part of repair he understood best. The rest, the soft, porous work of staying in the same room while someone else breathed, was unmeasured and unruly. So when the first meeting was scheduled, he prepared with the same methodical temperament he brought to every other detail. A list, a room cleared of stray emotion, a chair placed just so. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon and disinfectant. Cassidy sat with Marcus between them, shoulders subtly aligned the way two people in a makeshift partnership will lean toward a common horizon. Marcus's hand, banded by the thin brace he'd been given in physical therapy, rested on his knee like a small pledge. He had the look of someone beginning again in a town that remembered him only in fragments. Neighbors who once waved now averted their eyes at the sight of him. Storefronts that had been part of a daily route now held their steps like strangers. Bramwell arrived with the ledger under his arm and a manila envelope that contained the first transfer of funds earmarked Web Vocational Support. He sat across from them and opened the ledger as if opening a gate. For a long time the room was measured in the small sounds of chairs whispering, pages turning. Then Bramwell spoke, careful, deliberate, but not as a man issuing a directive. He read, in his clipped private cadence, the items he had authorized: rehabilitation sessions, a stipend for transportation, payment to a training program Marcus had tentatively named when Cassidy had called to ask. "What do you want to learn?" Bramwell asked finally, a question that surprised everyone in its simplicity. It read less like an instruction and more like an offer. Marcus blinked. He had expected questions that tested memory or shame. Instead, the invitation hung like an unlocked door. I used to fix things. At a shop," he said. The sound of his own voice was small in the room. "Engines mostly. Bikes when I could. I'd like, if it's not too much, to learn something I can stand on." Cassidy watched Bramwell the way someone watching a classically trained man attempt a new instrument, curious, patient, hands poised to catch any falter. Bramwell's pen hovered above a paper in a manner that communicated potential, but also the impatience of someone unused to not knowing outcomes. "Then we'll find a program," Bramwell said. "There is a facility downtown that runs apprenticeships. We'll enroll him. We'll cover tuition and travel until he is able, and I will attend the first 3 reviews personally." It was not a vow of transformation. It was, however, an act with teeth, money tied to milestones, meetings, and oversight. That was the ledger's native language, accountability by entry. Cassidy, who had spent weeks turning microscopic physical goals into lived achievements, felt her chest unclench with relief. Marcus nodded as if contact with a tangible bridge had been made. Outside the room, the household captain circulated new protocols. The satchel would be retained in secure storage, but cataloged as a resource for the fund rather than evidence of threat. Camera feeds in private areas would be reduced and shuttered at predictable times. Staff schedules would be adjusted, so overnight absences were logged and reviewed. The language was crisp and bureaucratic, but beneath it lay a different kind of work, convincing people who had spent careers inside systems of observation that eyes could be softened without surrendering safety. Resistance flickered in small places. An advisor to Bramwell who knew how reputations could be fragile suggested that any connection to the Eastern District be handled tightly, recommending lawyers and non-disclosure forms. Bramwell heard that counsel with the practiced patience of someone who had spent a life measuring exposure. He countered with meetings, fund ledgers, and a compact to attend in person. He refused, however, the immediate legalization of secrecy. The files would be used for care. They would not be weaponized. It would have been easy for the change to live only on paper. The harder work began in rooms where hands needed to relearn tasks. Bramwell showed up on a Tuesday to observe a therapy session because he had promised to attend the first meeting. He arrived because the ledger said he would, but he lingered because he found himself watching Addie in a way that no monitor could render. The therapist arranged cushions under her elbows and coaxed the small muscles in her shoulders into gestures that coalesced like the drafting of an alphabet. Bramwell, who had always used money as a tool to control risk, sat with the awkwardness of someone who did not know where to place his hands. For the first time he felt the difference between watching and doing. He learned haltingly how to hold a spoon for someone whose grasp had forgotten how to trust. Cassidy, who had taught these tasks for months, coached him in simple tones. Support her here, wait for the blink, let her choose the angle. He made errors, lifting too quickly, offering objects before Addie signaled readiness, and each error felt like a notation writ small in his chest. It was worse, at intervals, than being threatened by rivals. It was the slow work of being needed without mastery. Marshalling funds also required governance. They established the Webb Vocational Fund in a small bureaucratic ceremony in which a bank official explained disbursement schedules and compliance checks. Cassidy insisted on practical, immediate uses, transport passes, adaptive tools Marcus could use at home, and a stipend for a mobile phone. Bramwell insisted on documentation and milestones. They met in the middle. The fund covered Marcus's tuition at the apprenticeship, paid for a hand tool set that fit his current capacity, and arranged a mentor who agreed to teach him tasks compatible with his rehabilitation. Those early weeks were a weave of progress and tangle. Marcus learned to file metal edges again. He coughed and cursed when nerves protested. On the bad days, he would sit on a stoop and watch people who had not been injured move without friction through the city. Guilt coiled in him. It was like an aching tendon that wouldn't unstick. He confessed, once to Cassidy under a shop's awning, that he feared reliance, on money, on schedules. "I don't want to be a man who only takes," he said. "I want to be someone who makes," Cassidy replied with the unflashy logic of care. "Making is a series of small failures, Marcus. Then you try again. The fun doesn't make you less useful. It buys time for your hands to learn what your head remembers." Time, in that sense, was the currency that mattered most. Marcus made small maps of movement. A day when he could steady a wrench for 5 minutes. A morning when his left hand stopped trembling while he screwed a bolt. Each was a read line in a different ledger. Progress. Bramwell would receive those reports, clinical, thin, and the pages would thicken not only with numbers, but with little notes Cassidy tucked in margins. Marcus smiled at a joke. He kept his appointment. He stood longer than last week. Inside the house, changes rippled. Cameras in Addie's room were not simply turned off. They were repurposed. The security team, at Bramwell's instruction, shuttered several feeds during designated hours and replaced the lenses with framed prints after a meeting in which a therapist explained the importance of privacy. The surveillance room, once a constellation of blue-lit windows, gradually lost its appetite for constant watch. A crew came and removed the luminous racks of monitors and stacked them in a corner like a dismantled orchestra. 2 screens remained, black, inert, and Bramwell asked that one be kept to display a rotating set of images scanned from Cassidy's satchel. Marcus laughing at a kettle, Marcus pressing his head to a fogged window. The photographs, now digitized and displayed, turned instruments of memory into windows of their own, rather than acts of collection to be used against someone. Staff murmured about spectacle and softness. The captain grunted his reservations in a corridor discussion that was full of the cadence of people who survived on certainty. Yet he complied with new logbooks, new curfews, a system that emphasized presence and scheduled participation over continuous observation. The change meant more work and less autopilot. It meant humans had to do a job attention had been doing for them. For many, it felt like work of a different kind. Bramwell's circle was not without friction. The ledger's architecture had built him safety. To shift investments towards community-minded funds meant conversations at dinner tables and partner meetings that required explanation. A single contractor who had relied on surveillance contracts groused, and an associate who prized predictability muttered about opening doors that had been meant to be locked. Bramwell listened, and then, with a strangeness that had not been his before, made choices that prioritized repair over insurance. He reduced a security line item and reallocated the funds for a community outreach program that would provide adaptive tools and job placement support for victims of the Eastern District conflicts. He did not announce the reallocation as penance. He entered it into the ledger like any other expense, and perhaps that was the point. A moral act for him had become an itemized obligation. Months slid like a careful hand knitting an uneven pattern. Addie's small progress gathered into visible marks. A therapist recorded, at the 2-month meeting Bramwell attended, that Addie had experienced an increase in purposeful movement, language that would be dry in a hospital report, but incandescent to those who lived with the slow calculus of her days. She could now, with assistance, extend a hand to pluck a paper crane from a shelf and hold it before her face long enough to watch it move in the heart of a room. That crane, folded by Marcus in a clinic break with clumsy fingers and uneven creases, became an emblem. Cassidy carried it to the house one afternoon and placed it in Addie's line of sight. When Addie reached for it, her thumb caught Cassidy's memory again. The small movement that had stopped a burn. The room hummed softly with the Italian lullaby that had, increasingly, become a thread connecting their different worlds. Bramwell watched from a sideline chair and felt the ledger's ink change around that little paper bird. Marcus's apprenticeship progressed through fits. He learned to read a schematic and to anticipate the feel of worn metal. He found that the rhythm of hand and tool soothed him in a way therapy could not. The mentor, a man named Carlo, who had a shop smelling of oil, was brusque but fair. Carlo recognized the line of someone whose hands were honest. "You do the work right," he told Marcus the first month. "You get paid, you eat, you sleep. That's how you start being a man some people will hire." On a morning when rain made the streets silver, Marcus arrived late to the shop. His left hand trembled, and a flash of pain folded through his face. He thought of quitting, of hiding, returning to the small dishonesty of being an unwanted passenger in his own life. But Cassidy met him at the bus stop and offered a thermos of coffee and a note from Bramwell, promising extra time if the pain flared. They had negotiated so many small mercies by then that the idea of asking for them did not feel like weakness. Marcus took the coffee and then the hand of a man who had once measured risk with an unblinking eye. Bramwell did not become easy. The ledger still sat in his study like a spine of rules. He remained watchful, precise, and prone to calculating possibilities. But at the apprentice's graduation, an informal moment when a man with grease-stained knuckles held a certificate that read modestly of training, a different kind of weight sat on his shoulders. He attended because he had promised. He stayed because he found his view of duty had altered. The gratitude he felt became a small, puzzling thing he did not immediately know how to spend. Progress, however, never arrived without relapses. There were nights when a local gossip column sniffed for any trace of scandal and published slanted notes about the mysterious fund and the House of Glass changing its rules. Bramwell's advisors bristled, staff whispered in corners. Old loyalties warmed their hands by the embers of suspicion. Marcus, too, had bad days. Flare-ups that sent him back to the clinic. A call from an indebted relative that pinched at his resolve. Cassidy found herself mediating not only between people and schedules, but between impatience and hope. She learned to tell Marcus that his anger was a natural consequence of injury, that his progress would not be linear, and that the fund existed to make the line possible again. In those hard hours, Bramwell did something he had not done before. He listened without immediately converting sorrow into solutions. He sat in a therapy room while Marcus described a small humiliation and did not offer a contractual fix. He put his hand on the back of a chair and learned to let silence be its own repair. He failed, often. Sometimes he offered a fund before he offered an ear. Sometimes he retreated to the ledger to compute a schedule instead of staying for a song. Those were the days when Cassidy feared they would revert to old habits, when the cameras would once again become the default muscle. But the small architecture of change proved sturdier than a single man's old reflexes. More concrete reforms took shape. The surveillance room was officially repurposed. The monitors were stripped of their live feeds and reassembled into a community education station. Bramwell funded a series of workshops run by the vocational program, welding labs twice a week for young men and women from neighborhoods that had borne the brunt of brokered violence. Cassidy sat at the first afternoon's registration table and watched as attendees hesitated and then registered. They were people who had previously been turned into data in Bramwell's ledger, lines on a page, exposures to be managed. Now they had a space where instruction, not observation, would be the daily routine. The ribbon cutting for the repurposed room was small and slightly awkward. Bramwell stood with a pair of scissors in his hand as if his fingers had never been asked to do a public, symbolic cleaving. He spoke haltingly, not of absolution, but of responsibility. He did not promise the world. He promised a continuing effort and attendance at certain meetings. The promise was less theatrical and more stubborn than that. A procedural commitment to being present. Addie's progress rippled outward in ways that were not always linear. There were days when the therapist recorded progress that pleasantly surprised everyone, and days when her body yielded nothing. But she had by then learned the particular grammar of Cassidy's hands. She could react to a melody now with a small tightening of the jaw that meant she recognized a pattern. She could, on good afternoons, track a paper bird's movement across a table for a breath longer than she had months before. These were not miracles. They were enumerated steps filed by therapists and celebrated in small acts. An extra minute of reading, a hand held a beat longer. One afternoon, as summer light slanted across the courtyard, Bramwell found himself pressed into the odd intimacy of bringing Addie a book he had chosen, a hardcover volume with pictures of sea animals. He did not know how to read to her at first. His voice hit edges where a practiced reader's would land as silk. But he stumbled through a passage, mispronounced a name, and felt, beneath his embarrassment, a slight, unnameable pleasure. When Addie reached, with the slow intention the therapist had taught them to watch for, and placed a paper bird, folded, imperfect, creased by small fingers, into his hand, he experienced the ledger shift again. The object was no dossier. It was a token. He left the book with the therapists, and, in his office, placed the bird atop the ledger as if it were an errata, a comment in the margin that insisted on softness. The bird did not change his entries overnight, but it nudged pen and hand toward a new set of notations. Calls returned with less defensiveness. A meeting attended with fewer lines crossed off in irritation. Repairs showed up in other, less formal ways. The neighborhood corner store, noticing Marcus's clean work and steady attendance, offered him a part-time morning shift to test his stamina. He kept the job intermittently at first, and then with increasing reliability. He took a bus route he had not felt able to manage, and asked Cassidy to meet him at the stop when the first storm of nerves rose. Each small, mundane victory, paying a bill on time, waking without dread, added stitches to a life that had once been a ragged thing. Cassidy remained the quiet axis of many of these small turns. She juggled schedules, argued with administrators, and spent nights writing notes in the Satchel's journal that were now designated as part of the fund's documentation. Her motives remained complicated. Grief sat near the surface of her choices, and at times anger flickered like a distant fuse. She did not use Addie as leverage. She used the lever of presence and persistence. She kept photographs not because she planned to strike anyone, but because memory, for her, was a material of care. In the ledger's margins, she wrote small triumphs. Marcus took the bus on his own. Addie reached for a bird. Bramwell stayed for a meeting. They celebrated modestly. The workshop had an open evening where Marcus presented a small bench he'd helped construct. It was not perfect. One leg was slightly less level than the others. But it bore the scratch of his name, and a half-dozen neighborhood people came to see it set in a corner of the community room. Bramwell stood by the back wall and applauded smaller than the rest, an expression half surprised to find he could clap without counting the returns. Cassidy watched him out of the corner of her eye and smiled not with triumph, but with a guarded, long-held contentment. Not all moments were tidy. A morning came when a reporter called, asking point-blank whether Bramwell's sudden philanthropic turn was the cover for something deeper. Bramwell, who had always controlled narratives through shadow and ledger, answered with a kind of bluntness he had not practiced before. He would not apologize for trying to repair harm he had a role in. The exchange was uncomfortable. The paper printed a story that phrased things in skeptical tones. Bramwell felt anger rise, and then, slowly, accepted that accountability sometimes meant tolerating scrutiny. He learned other disciplines, too. In an unplanned hour, when the night's watch had thinned and the lemon tree thickened the air with scent, Bramwell sat across from Cassidy in the repurposed surveillance room, now a training space with benches and a whiteboard. The screens were black. One, they had designated to display scanned images from the satchel, a rotation of moments frozen and then liberated into a new context. Bramwell touched one of the black panels as if testing whether the glass would burn him. Cassidy, who had once been ordered to erase the very thing now projected, sat nearby with her own small private watchfulness. "You ever think about burning them?" Bramwell asked, not accusing but curious in a way that had nothing to do with the ledger. Cassidy looked at him with the soft, weary patience she had learned to reserve for people who measured life in accounts. "Every day," she said. "But it's not that simple. These are a record of a life. They remind us what it costs when people are hurt. If we burn them, we lose the proof that someone returned. Memory matters." He nodded. "I know," he said. "That's why I wanted copies making." Then he stopped and let the sentence dangle, as if to yield space for what he could not yet name. Cassidy reached into her bag, the satchel's leather worn to a familiar crease, and took out a single photograph she had kept in a pocket. It was Marcus at a market stall, one shoulder turned, smile like an unfinished sentence. She handed it to Bramwell. He turned the image in his fingers, surprised at the warmth that rose in his chest. It was, he realized, not simply a ledger entry, but evidence of what he had a hand in making whole again. As the months curved into a year, the ledger acquired new columns of work, notations of community workshops, travel reimbursements, meeting dates. Bramwell's pen scrawled through entries with a different cadence. Sometimes the ink lagged because his hands trembled when he wrote something that felt like atonement. He still made errors, tyrannical impulses that bubbled up in tired evenings. He still measured. But he also learned to leave empty rows in which nothing was quantified, but which made room for being. One evening, when twilight pressed like a thumb against the windows, a recital was organized in the house. A small, carefully managed event in the repurposed room where neighbors and trainees and staff could gather. Addie was wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of lemon and starch. Marcus came in with a new jacket and the slight posture of someone who had relearned how to carry himself. Bramwell sat with his hands folded, the ledger closed on his lap like a book that no longer needed to be upright at every hour. The recital was not grand. A music therapist led songs. A trainee showed a small demonstration of repair work. A woman from the neighborhood read a poem about seagulls and small returns. When it came time for Addie to participate, Cassidy lifted her to a chair at the center and set a paper bird before her. The room settled into a silence that felt like permission. Addie extended her hand. It trembled a little, a detail recorded in the therapist's notes as an increase in volitional movement. The paper bird, held between soft fingers, rested on Addie's palm for a moment like a quiet triumph. Bramwell felt the room tilt at that small act in a way he had not anticipated. It was not only the bird, it was the unforced exchange of an object between two people, not mediated by a camera or ledger. He understood, with surprising clarity, that presence was not a program to be written into a book, but an accumulation of tiny, unbilled acts. Later, when the lights dimmed and the house hummed with the residue of goodwill, Bramwell lingered in the repurposed surveillance room. A staff member had removed the last of the active feeds that night. The monitors were blank. One screen, however, showed a looped image of Marcus at a market, hands animated while he explained something to a woman who laughed. Bramwell put his palm to the dead glass of a monitor beside it, the one that no longer fed him the constant blue glare of live images, and felt for the first time in years the absence of watching as a kind of relief. Bramwell waited in his office, his eyes fixed on the blank screens, expecting the bags, and the secrets they held, to be ash. But when the door swung open, Cassidy wasn't empty-handed. She stepped into the blue light of the monitors and dropped the medical pump she had rescued from the bag onto his desk with a heavy thud. "You wanted me to burn the evidence," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the room like a blade. "But I felt it moving. I felt the pulse of a crime you've been committing for years." Bramwell's face went pale as he looked at the sedative device. "Addie isn't paralyzed, Bramwell," Cassidy continued, stepping closer. "She's being suppressed. You've been drugging your own daughter to keep her from claiming her mother's inheritance." The Mafia boss reached for the intercom to call his guards, but Cassidy acted with the speed of someone who had nothing left to lose. She held up her phone. "Don't. I've already uploaded the logs from that device to a secure server. If anything happens to me, or if Addie doesn't start a real recovery program today, the entire syndicate will know you've been stealing from your own blood." For the first time, the man who controlled the city through glass was trapped in his own cage. He looked at the monitors and saw not a daughter to be managed, but a witness he could no longer silence. Cassidy had done the impossible. She used his own surveillance state to bring him to his knees. The ledger was no longer about risk, it was about survival. Addie would walk again, Marcus would be cared for, and the Mafia boss would finally have to answer to the truth. If you think Cassidy was a hero for standing up to power, type "truth" in the comments. Subscribe for more stories where the underdog always wins. Outside, the city made its usual noises, an ambulance in the distance, a neighbor's radio, and inside the house the lemon tree dropped a leaf onto the path like a tiny benediction. The satchel, which had nearly been consumed by flames on a different night, rested in a secure drawer as a kind of archive. Cassidy sometimes took it out and smoothed photographs between her fingers, not to preserve leverage, but to remember where people had started. She would, from time to time, lay a photo where Bramwell could see it, and allow him to be able to look without having to justify the glance. In the months that followed, the fund paid for a modified toolbox and a motor that Marcus learned to coax into rotation. He learned to measure torque, and to read the hum of a machine like a language. He learned to be punctual because timetables are values that grow meaning when practiced. Addie accumulated minutes of intentionality. Bramwell showed up at a council meeting to decide on allocation of resources and surprised many when he argued for reinvesting a small portion of his holdings into the apprenticeship program, not to launder a reputation, but to sustain a network of repair. Small setbacks continued to surface, as integrity seldom erases all consequences at once. A former associate called quietly to insinuate that Bramwell's commitments were naive. Bramwell paid no mind and moved budgets. That, in itself, felt like a kind of small rebellion. The captain had days when he missed the old logic of absolute surveillance and would grumble about softening his guard. Bramwell listened and adjusted schedules rather than staff loyalties. He asked for accountability meetings in which he would answer questions rather than issue directives. The ledger's architecture was still there. It had merely gained new language. One night, months after the match that had been held by a thumb, Bramwell found a note slipped beneath the ledger's cover. It was Cassidy's handwriting. A single line that read, "Presence matters. Thank you for showing up." There was no flourish, no demand. Bramwell placed the note in his chest pocket and allowed the warmth of it to sit there. Years did not pass like sudden epiphanies. They went by in increments, a job retained, a hand steadied, a bird folded and unfolded and given away. At the 3-year reporting of the Webb Vocational Fund, Marcus stood beside Bramwell on a stage in the repurposed room and spoke for 3 minutes about the stability of a paycheck and the dignity of skill. He spoke without bitterness. Behind him, Addie, a little older, her gaze more attentive, applauded and placed a new paper bird on the table. Bramwell, who had once thought presence could be measured like money, felt something unquantifiable settle into the ledger's spine. He did not become a different man overnight. Shadows still found him. Old instincts still rose when he felt threatened. But the camera feeds no longer had first claim on his attention. The repurposed room hummed with the sound of ordinary work. The satchel remained catalogued but no longer suspected. Cassidy kept her journal in a drawer that had become a resource for the fund's reports and for occasional shows that featured community photographs. The photographs, digitized and curated, became a way to remember that injury had history and that healing required patient architecture. At the end of one ordinary day, Bramwell returned to the repurposed room and took the hand of a small girl who had once been bound to a bed and watched through blue glass. Addie took his fingers with a slow, deliberate trust that had been coaxed out of countless little actions. She placed a paper bird, this one carefully folded, its wings balanced, into his palm. He turned it between his fingers and then laid it on the black screen of a monitor that seldom glowed now. He set his other hand flat against the dead glass beside it and felt the cool smoothness like the back of a page. He thought of the match, the thumb, the moment that had redirected hearts and accounts. The house had been made to watch in order to control. It had taught him that eyes are useful, but that hands are what mend. What had begun with an order to burn a bag had unfolded into something slower. A ledger of meetings, a fund with modest real-world consequences, a reallocation of attention, and the stubborn accumulation of small acts. Outside, the city moved as it always did, lives stitching and fraying, while inside, a man who built walls leaned his forehead against the idea of patience. He did not declare himself absolved. He did not presume the arc complete. What he had learned was more modest, that the smallest movement, an involuntary thumb closing on a hand, could change the temperature of a decision and reroute the course of a house. Cassidy, Marcus, and Addie did not end the story with a single victory. They carried it forward with repeated, unglamorous work. Appointments kept, meetings attended, workshops run, a repurposed room that taught skills instead of collecting footage. Bramwell's ledger of exposures would always be a part of him, but the pages grew new listings. Community hours, apprenticeship graduates, a list of times he attended the meetings he had promised. On the night of a small celebration, a table strewn with simple cakes and coffee, Cassidy stood by the window and hummed the Italian lullaby out loud. "Buonanotte, Luna," she sang in the language that had once been a small bridge between two people. Addie, across the room, smiled and clapped in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or ledgers. Marcus laughed at something someone said, and then looked toward Bramwell with an ease that had taken time to earn. When the house hummed down and the guests left, Bramwell remained for a moment in the repurposed room. He placed his hand on the black glass of an inert monitor, the same glass that had once allowed him to watch without touching, and he held it there as if to feel what absence of surveillance might mean on his own skin. The satchel, once set to be consumed by heat on the edge of a match, lay in a drawer catalogued and respected. The photograph that had first nudged his ledger now hung, printed on the wall of the repurposed room, a reminder not of scandal but of continuity. He thought of the night he had given the order. He thought of the match and of the thumb that had closed and said, in the smallest biological voice, "Not this." And he thought of Cassidy, who had refused the erasure, who had turned a match into an argument for presence. He thought of how power could be rerouted by modest acts, and of how responsibility meant being present long after the headlines had cooled. The house was quieter now in a different way. The monitors no longer dictated rhythms. People did. Bramwell made one final notation that evening, small and nearly private. Attend monthly check-ins. Continue fund allocations. Review camera policy annually. Keep hands in the work. He left the repurposed room with a paper bird folded and tucked into his pocket. He did not need to look at it to know it was there. The thumb that had held a match at bay had not caused a miracle. It had instead redirected choices. It had proven that when someone feels something move, when touch interrupts order, it can be the seed of repair. If this story stayed with you, if the image of a small thumb closing against a hand struck you as the hinge of hope, take a moment to say which small movement mattered most to you in the comments. Share this with someone who believes that repair is a practiced habit, not a sudden absolution.